Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Death Space Filling the Void. I'm Patrick Jones talking to you from a very cold and rainy Charleston, South Carolina. That kind of weather kind of shifts the focus towards death. A little bit, at least. Well, I'm so excited that this is the first episode in season 2. I have 10 episodes recorded and ready to go. Jumping back into this podcast after launching season 1 of my other podcast called That Gives Me Anxiety. Show about the things that scare us and why they may not be so scary after all. I have some amazing interviews lined up for season 2. I interview an astrophysicist on the death of the universe itself, several philosophers, have some people who were extremely open and honest about their stories of grief, a Buddhist monk. But today we're kicking it all off with Joèl S. Anthony, aka the Grave Woman. Joelle's a funeral director, embalmer, as well as a blogger and teacher. She runs a popular YouTube channel called The Grave Woman, where she answers questions that a lot of people may have about death and the process of embalming, and also offers education for people who are interested in studying that. We had a great conversation. This is the first time I had really spoken with anyone who works in the industry of death. And I was curious to hear how working in death affects life. How being around the end may change how you live your day-to-day life. And Joelle had a lot of insight into that. So let's just jump right into the interview. Enjoy. Joining me now is Joèl, the Grave Woman, who's a funeral director, and a licensed embalmer. Did I get all that right?
Yes, I am technically a licensed funeral director and embalmer, but I like to refer to myself as a sacred death and grief care practitioner.
I love that. That sounds so nice. Thank you so much for coming, by the way.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah. Where does that title that you just mentioned come from? Why do you look at it like that?
I am from Beaufort, South Carolina, which is basically the hub of the Geechee and Gullah culture. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
No, but I'd love to hear about it.
So basically, Beaufort, South Carolina is where the slave ships dropped off basically the majority of the slaves here in America. Mm-hmm. And because of our culture back home, where we still practice a lot of what are considered to be ancient African traditions, mm-hmm. that take place at the time of death, I said, oh my gosh, what we do back home is a little bit different than the way that we practice funeral service here in Georgia or other places that I've heard people talk about and seen funeral service practice other places. And I'm like, wow, what we do is really sacred. Mm-hmm. So my work is sacred in a sense. And I believe that the death and grief space is sacred. So I just made that a part of my brand.
I love that. And it's so nice too, it almost feels as if, I don't know, you're a bit of a shepherd, like helping not only the individual, but the family cross over and start to focus on their grief and move forward with their lives. So I'm curious, what are some of the differences?
Some of the customs at the time of death and preparing for death, when, we have that luxury of preparing, maybe singing at the bedside, certain songs, even like clapping. Clapping is a form of ushering in spirit, whether you refer to that spirit as the Holy Spirit, the spirit of ancestors, some of the same done at normal funerals, but everything has a purpose. Everything that we do have is a purpose. The buildings that we live in have shutters that have certain colors, most of the time blue. And when someone passes away, those shutters are closed to keep out evil spirits or spirits that can attack the family or cause stress or, unwanted spirits that have transitioned from visiting the home during the time of grief and mourning, or even viewing the body. My mom talks to me a lot about when she was a little girl, actually being picked up and passed over the casket, handed from one adult to another so that she would not forget the deceased. I haven't seen that done recently, but just little things like that aren't done other places, or allowing time for family members to really not have to do anything but rest and mourn. There's a strong sense of community where the mourners and those that have experienced loss are just allowed to just mourn in a deeper way than they are outside of our area, our town, our culture back home.
Nice.
It's been impacted a lot by COVID, of course, because of social distancing, but a lot of times church members or community members will come in and actually clean the home.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Actually making meals for the family to eat for a month instead of just for that few days or few weeks, or just having dreams interpreted of the deceased loved one, or actually making space for visitation of the deceased spirit. So just things that aren't really practiced or talked about that I haven't seen done outside of my culture, I try to bring into the work that I do.
I love that. Well, especially, you know, people are about to go into potentially the worst time of their lives, right? Like grief, people always refer to that. I mean, it's easy to see after loss. So allowing people to kind of trim the fat, so to speak, from their lives and focus on themselves and what's so important. I think that's always wonderful. I think I have friends who are Jewish, and I always appreciated sitting Shiva because it's just, let's all sit together and eat and talk and just, I don't know, it feels like a little less formal. I was raised Catholic, and, you know, everyone's dressed to the nines, and I don't know, it just feels a little bit less formal in a good way.
In a good way. Right. And even with that, it's not uncommon for the entire community to just show up at your house after someone dies without calling or making an appointment. My grandfather passed away. I was just sick of people coming over. But that's just a part of our culture. You know, we embrace each other in a way that I haven't seen outside of the coastal Carolina culture. So there are tons of little things, but I don't want to give too much away.
Okay, sure. But I do love that. I mean, it's so wonderful, right? If it takes a village to raise a child, it can take a village to deal with grief together, knowing that everyone's got your back.
Definitely. And that's another thing. Children aren't shielded from death. Culture. We're encouraged to go to funerals. We're encouraged to participate in arrangements. We're encouraged to participate in, you know, speaking at the funeral, singing at the funeral, expressing what that person meant to us. And I've noticed, especially here in Georgia, a lot of times when working with non-African American families, children are kind of left away from all of that. And at first it seemed a little strange to me, but it's just not a part of everyone's culture. I think that from a young age, I was taught about death.
I agree with what you're saying, that kids should, a lot of times I feel like kids are introduced to death when it comes to like the loss of like a goldfish or something like that, and instead of like grandma or uncle or whatever it is. But then I feel like it builds this stigma around death, and there's many stigmas around death and dying. But how being in a culture where children are introduced to death earlier and talk to like adults, how do you think that impacts them as they get older?
I think I can only speak for myself and my sister because and even my cousins, because we grew up going, a lady that was like a grandma, she was technically my aunt by marriage, or my great aunt by marriage, but she and my mom basically ran the missionary society at the church that we went to, right? So they were responsible for community outreach, especially like around this time. We'd always be making these baskets and these like toiletry packages and love packages to take to nursing homes, right?
That's so wonderful.
Right. Well, thank you. And we deliver them to like the sick and shut in, the elderly or sick in our community, and specifically our church, who didn't have families or resources, or, you know, weren't able to get up and go to the store. So we saw people as they aged, but not in a glorified light, so to speak. Like they weren't driving on a golf cart into the sunset. They were in nursing homes. They were in assisted living homes. They were deteriorating. So I understood very early on that this is temporal, right? It's body. In addition, when I was about 6 or 7 years old, my best friend at the time died. She was playing hide and seek with her brother, and do you remember the old Range Rovers, how the spare tire was actually in the back of the car
Yes.
instead of on the outside like it is now, like that
Mm-hmm.
that look, or was, I don't know if it is now, but she got in there and got caught.
Oh
She
no.
suffocated. And I remember there was like this big search for her and everybody
Oh
was
my
looking for
goodness.
her. And then she was found. Her mom actually got in the car and, smelt something, and yeah,
Oh my
it
gosh, I'm
was
so
her.
sorry.
And the crazy thing is, I remember her name when my mom tells me her name. I just remember one day she was there, and the next day I was told she had died.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like her family had a private funeral because she had been missing for like maybe 2 weeks or a week or so. So she was
Mm-hmm.
very deteriorated and decomposed. But it just having that experience is like, okay, death doesn't just happen to old people either. It can happen to younger people.
Right.
But I appreciate that my parents didn't like tell me she fell asleep or Jesus came to pick her up and he needed an angel or something simplistic like that. Like it was just like she passed away and this is what death means. So for me, having that experience and having that understanding was like, okay, death can happen to anyone. And I did have pets and, conversations about death, about pets and things like that as well. And I don't think anything's wrong with that. I mean, it's a personal choice. You talk to your kids about death. But I think back home, not everyone has my experience, but conversations about death aren't kept away from children. And I think it's healthy. Some people may think it's traumatic. In addition, I also had an uncle that was a funeral director. So he would answer all my questions. He would let me come to the funeral home with him when I was, older. I'll say maybe 9, 10, 11 and up, and let me help him dress the deceased and ride in the hearse with him.
Really?
Yes, and sit in the back, of the chapel of the funeral home and watch services take place. So I think for me, morbid curiosity played a bigger role than family influence. But without that family influence, I don't know if I would be as curious, if that makes sense.
Sure. Well, especially since that's such a unique experience. I was going to ask you how you began working with death, but I feel like I have that answer.
Yeah.
It was sort of maybe even a family business where your uncle was working there. And what started that? What started you? Were you close to your uncle, or was it
Oh,
just more
very.
just
I was
curious?
very close to him. He was 19 years older than I was. He passed away in 2015, but he was 19 years older than I am. I don't even think I understood that he was a funeral director until he explained to me that he worked with the deceased. And I still didn't know what that meant until he actually brought me in and let me see what he did. And I mean, I would ask him the craziest questions. This would be my favorite time of year because I knew Uncle Mark was going to be home and I knew I had to find out what happened to dead bodies. And I would have a laundry list of questions for him. What do you do with the insides? What happens to the eyeballs? Who closes their eyes? This, that, and the other. So I just think that excitement, because I tried to do other things. I went to hair school. I went to business school, and it just all came full circle to funeral service because it includes all those things. So
Yeah. Well, it's really nice to hear you being so excited. I'm so curious, what emotion is that excitement tied to? Is it helping people? Is it? I'll let you. I want to hear your. I don't want to words in your mouth.
Fine. I think it's definitely helping people because there's two sides to funeral service traditionally. There's the funeral director side where you're actually working with the families, you're making the arrangements for funerals and burials, you're doing the paperwork, filing the death certificates, making the obituaries, putting things in the newspaper. I love that. That's actually what I'm best at, connecting with people during that time.
You're building a memorial to a person's life. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I tell people jokingly. I plan the best final parties that you'll ever see in your life. But there's also the more scientific side, which is the embalming and the anatomy, and then the hair and the makeup and the nails and the placement of the hands and the mouth and creating expression that isn't there. And I think that's a little bit of a mad scientist side of my personality. And then the mystery and intrigue of this is a vessel that has carried an individual's spirit through their entire life. I'm also a very deeply spiritual person.
Okay.
So I think having access to what happens behind that curtain of the illusion we have of what happens at death, it does something for me. And I don't know exactly what that thing is.
Mm-hmm.
And now, since I've kind of transitioned from more of the in-home funeral preparations and embalming to the education side of things, connecting with individuals who have that same curiosity and fire that I have in myself, but they really don't know what to do with it or where to place it, and then helping them light the path for their careers, it's the best feeling in the world. So I think that's where my excitement is right now. For a while, I did lose that fire for funeral directing and embalming. I don't know if it was burnout, or I don't want to say it was boredom, because it wasn't, but I just knew I wasn't really doing all I could do. So that kind of shifted my direction.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, it seems like we both are curious about death, and in two senses of the coin, I think we're both very curious about death and what happens and the vulnerability and grief and everything. And in my way, that's come out in making this podcast, and in your way, it was actually handling bodies and being there right on the front lines. I don't know if I could handle that because so many reasons, right? Like, I'm so curious, how do you deal with the emotions of being around dead bodies and people who are frankly just heartbroken from day
Right.
to day?
It can be draining. I
Mm-hmm.
actually had to create a whole course on funeral or death care professional self-care, because the thing is, Patrick, it's like in my mind, I'm there. I know I can't fix it. I know I can't make it better, but
Mm-hmm.
I can do something that they can't do in that moment,
Mm.
which is think clearly and put the pieces together that they don't even know need to be put together, right? When I say they, I mean the family or the loved ones of the deceased. And then with the deceased, I can present them back to their families in a way that's going to provide them some level of peace and comfort prayerfully.
Sure.
But on the flip side, if there aren't boundaries in place that I've had to learn how to put in place, I can get totally lost in it emotionally
Mm.
without even realizing it. I won't say that it's depressing, but for me, I struggle with reverse projection. This happened to this person. What if something like this would have happened to somebody I love?
Mm.
Or what if I was in their situation? Or what if what's going to happen if my dad, or when my dad dies? Or what happens if I die before my parents and they have to make my funeral arrangements? Like that's how it presents for me. I knew that was going to happen.
It's quite all right.
Love.
Both of our
Sorry.
dogs are making their presence known in the podcast.
Love, please come here. Sorry.
No sweat, no
Just
sweat.
had to
Love. Hi, love.
love everybody, Anthony.
That's amazing.
But there are emotions, but at the same time, like I said, I'm a very deeply spiritual person, and I believe that when we're walking in our purpose, we have grace
Mm.
for what it is that we're put here to do. And I believe I'm put here to do this. So that comes with a certain level of grace that you may not have to do this job.
Totally.
Right.
It's
Or
almost like
grace.
it feels like a dead person is frankly at, I want to use the word, I want to say they're at their most vulnerable, right? And
Mhm.
someone needs to help them have a dignified passing,
Right.
and that's exactly what you're providing for them. And
Mhm.
it seems like that's what's compels you to move forward in a job like that.
Right. Like
Oh,
I don't
that's
have the
wonderful.
grace to be a death doula. Death doulas actually sit with the person and their family if they have
Hmm.
a family through transition. I don't have the grace for that. I would be an emotional wreck
Yeah.
doing that. But I do have the grace. The deceased body is I don't want to say the easiest part of what I do, but I think that's where people think that most of the fear or stress or trauma associated with this profession comes from, but it's literally the least. that's scientific. You can figure out how to work with the deceased and honor them in a way that is best for them and their family and for you. It's the emotions and the sitting with the family and seeing them in pain that's hard. But
Right.
I always work from the standpoint of let me give the best, let me give them the experience I would want to have in their position.
That's so beautiful. Thank you very much for that. That's very nice. You know, you mentioned you were going with your uncle and seeing bodies. Was there a transition period where that was like scary or nerve-wracking? No, none at all.
There have been 2 times when I've been scared.
Okay.
It's not funny, but I'm laughing. The first time, there's like a nervousness, of course. Like I feel a nervousness every time I look at a deceased for the first time, because a lot, especially in traumatic cases where the deceased has like gunshot wound or car accident or something, maybe cancer ate away at their face, because you just don't know what you're going to see. So there's
Right.
always like that feeling in my gut, right? But the 2 times that I've been scared were the first day of our embalming lab in mortuary school, where we saw an autopsy. I'd never seen an autopsy case before, and I was terrified. I'd never seen an autopsy case before, and I just didn't know what to expect. And when I went into the room and saw a human body wide open, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. But at the same time, the excitement and the adrenaline of, wow, I'm finally going to see this,
Yeah.
outweighed the fear.
And
There was a moment where I almost like putting my hand on the door. It was like, do I really want to do this? How am I going to walk away from this for the rest of my life?
yeah.
But I
Like
don't know.
making a choice that's it.
Right.
You can't go exit that
Can't go
door once
back.
you enter. Well, what is
Right.
it? Is it obviously part of an autopsy is to identify what was going on with the person when they passed. Does that mean what I think it means, which means like things are just open and out and inspected, and that can be a
So
bit unsettling?
this was well, now, to be clear, we didn't see the actual autopsy. It was just that the individual that our embalming instructor was working on
Mm-hmm.
had been autopsied. And for the sake of our anatomy courses and our embalming courses, we were required to sit in the embalming lab and watch he and upperclassmen embalm an autopsy body.
Okay.
So when we walked into the room, the lights were off in the observatory area, but in the lab, the lights were on and there were mirrors on the ceiling so that we could look up and see down inside of the cavity. So the deceased had the standard Y incision.
Mm-hmm.
Their organs had been removed, so it was just an empty cavity. And I'd never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
And the second time that I was afraid, I have another job outside of mortuary science, but it's in the medical profession. I'm not going to say the name for the sake of, confidentiality. Sure. But one of my friends came to my desk and said, "Oh my God, there's a head on the table upstairs."
Oh God.
And I'm like, "What?" She's like, "There's a head on the table upstairs. You have to come see this." And so walking upstairs, I was like, "Oh my God, I'm just about to see a human head on the table," because I've never seen anyone decapitated or disarticulated with just their head remaining. And so I saw that. And those are the only 2 times I've really been afraid.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that sounds very, feel very afraid. Oh my goodness. Well, at least, that is nice to know that you don't live in constant fear while you're doing it. Or it's, you see it more as a puzzle or a recipe, or, here's where the starting point is, and we have to get this individual to this end point to get ready for their last journey, so to speak.
Right. And just to be clear, that individual whose head was on the table, they had donated their body to science. So it wasn't like someone had been careless and just left the head out, just to be clear.
Right. Yeah,
but you asked about the transition with my uncle. My mom was definitely afraid, but she was supportive. And I guess she was tired of me asking her questions and begging her to go. It was kind of like, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Or can I have it? Can I have it?" And she's like, "You know what? Just go. Go with your uncle." Because I'd asked several times before and I'd been told no. before I actually went. So my uncle talked to me. He sat me down, and the thing that he explained to me was that this isn't fun. This is what I do, and these are people just like you and I. When you walk into this space, you're to be respectful. You're to honor their privacy. You're to be not quiet, but you're not to yell. You're not to run around. This isn't a game. This is basically sacred. So that's
Yeah,
what
that's
that
so true. It's
like.
similar to almost here in New York. I've been a few times to the the imprint for 9/11, where the buildings were, and for the most part everyone respects that as hollowed ground, and not, this isn't
Yes.
the place to act up. So it makes perfect sense what you're describing. Similar to what your uncle was saying, I remember being a little kid and being afraid of ghosts, and my mom coming in, and to put me at ease, she was like, ghosts are just people, at the time my grandfather was dead, and she was like, listen, my dad would never hurt anyone, so there's no reason to be afraid of ghosts, and not, that's completely different than working on a body, but the sentiment remains that a dead body is one of us. It's just a
Right.
person who's passed, and ultimately we'll all make that trip. So it's wonderful to hear that, at least in your story, they'll be met with grace and dignity that they deserve.
Have you experienced a ghost?
As a kid, I feel like I did, but who knows? Why? Is that something you've experienced?
Um, when I used to work in a cemetery,
Okay.
and I think that I had a couple of experiences there.
Yeah.
But I prayed a long time ago, and I made a deal with God that if I was going to do this, He was not going to let me see any ghosts because I couldn't handle it. And if this was
Yeah.
the work I had, He had to do that. Now I can feel spirits, good and bad. When you're in an environment, or you get that sixth sense about something, but seeing them, no, sir. That's scary. That is scary.
Yeah, that is scary.
Yeah.
Well, when it comes to spirits like that, so when you're working on a body are you by yourself?
There have been times plenty of times when I've been by myself.
And you feel energies coming off the individual, or just, in the space that you're in?
It's very hard to explain. I don't want to say that the energy is coming off of the individual, because I've never been able to determine whether it's their energy or the energy that, I think when someone dies, there's the space, the veil is thin. And I think there are people on the other side and entities on the other side, just like we're over here. So I don't want to say it's coming from the deceased. I just think the veil is even thinner around them.
Almost
So
like it's a door opening, and there
yeah.
could be something waiting. Ooh.
What I do, I introduce myself just like I would to you. Hey, I'm Joèl. I'm here to get you together for your family. I'm going to do the best that I can to be respectful, and I come in peace.
Yeah.
So
How can you argue with those terms?
don't
Right?
bother me.
Yeah.
You cannot
I'm
come
not here
home
to
with
bother
me.
you.
You
Yeah.
cannot come home with me. I learned early on to tell them, you cannot come home with me, because I've heard stories of things going home with people, and I actually had that experience.
Really?
This was before I started working on bodies or anything. I was working in the cemetery, and my friend and I we had 3 Jewish sections in our cemetery. And I thought it was so beautiful that people left rocks in that part of the cemetery. And there was this beautiful monument in the cemetery for this like 15-year-old boy who died in a car accident. And my friend and I used to walk through the cemetery after I get off work, and we left rocks on his grave, but we didn't wash our hands in that sink that they have in the Jewish cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
And I felt a presence around me for like a week after, and then it hit me, oh my God, you left something there and you didn't cleanse yourself before you left. And this isn't your culture, or you don't know him, so you probably shouldn't have done anything. So I went and I washed my hands and removed the rock that I put on, and washed my hands, and it went away.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard multiple people describe in situations or areas where death just naturally is, right? Like cemeteries or hospitals like that they have said, and they stand by the notion that you have to say, you can't come home with me. Very interesting how that works. You never invited them, but they will listen if you say that.
Yeah.
Well, at least it's nice to know there are some rules that
Yeah.
we can all agree upon. Okay, so here's the big question. What has working in death taught you about life?
To appreciate everything.
Mm.
I mean, everything. Like the fact that I can sit here in my body and this thing that I'm in has carried me through 34 years of life is just astonishing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So to be grateful for it, and I'm healthy. I have a mind and a consciousness that
Mm-hmm.
makes decisions. I have a moral compass or a spirit or whatever you want to call it, a soul that knows when something is right or wrong, or gets a feeling for someone, or warns me, or gives me insight to things that I have no awareness of.
Mm-hmm.
It's given me a sense of gratitude that it's like nothing else I've felt. Prior to getting into death care, I don't want to say I was a completely different person, but it's definitely matured me.
Mm.
And to appreciate those that I love, and the fact
Mm.
that they're here and they're well, and that you truly never know.
Yeah.
Any minute could be your last minute. So for me, again, I believe in purpose. Once we fulfill our purpose, we don't know when that moment is. And anything that we do beyond that is borrowed time.
Yeah.
So when
What a
people
beautiful
die,
way. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
oh no, I was just going to say when people die, I've learned to look at life like, okay, they fulfilled their purpose. So it gives me a sense of peace about life ending.
It's such a beautiful way of living and approaching life, right? If you're smelling the roses all the time, telling people you love them, I mean, what else is there, right?
It sucks sometimes. I'm gonna be honest. Like I don't want to make it sound all like sunshine. It's like
Sure.
if somebody pisses me off and I want to be mad, and I get mad, it's like I'm always like, you know what? Is this guy like? Let's say worst case scenario, something happens to me or them. Is this really gonna matter? And so I always feel like I
Yeah.
have to be the bigger person and say, or not even the bigger person. I have to be the person that says, you know what? I'm sorry. Let's talk about this. And that
Yeah.
sucks because I also have an ego. Just
Sure.
like, can I curse?
Yeah.
It's like, fuck you, you know? But try to stay in the love and light.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally. Of course, of course. Not everything is all sugar and rainbows. So,
not at all.
yeah. But at least trying to savor.
It encourages me to live that way.
Exactly. Just wanted to step in real quick and let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Garnished Entertainment. Are you missing your friends? Yeah, the pandemic has been very long. Tired of unwinding in front of the TV? Losing your marbles ever so slightly? Not even slightly. Shake up your night with a Garnished virtual cocktail event. Garnished Entertainment is a New York City-based mixology event company with the mission of bringing communities together through creative and entertaining virtual cocktail classes. I've taken a class with these guys. It's a lot of fun, and it's good to be able to make a nice cocktail, one that like looks good, maybe has a little bit of a fancy ingredient, so you can brag or look like you were very productive during your quarantine, and keep it classy. Whether you're catching up with old friends, team building with colleagues, or looking for the perfect date night, Garnished would love to be your host. Let's garnish. So fun. Today's episode is also brought to you by My Software Tutor. The pandemic has changed a lot of things, and you may be doing a bit of a career pivot and need to learn some stuff, and I think that this is a great way to do that. Do you fear the spreadsheet? Yeah. It's daunting. I mean, learning any software is daunting. Phobia be gone. My Software Tutor offers 3 levels of real-time Zoom-based courses with a live instructor. They all deliver practical, functional business skills in a friendly, supportive environment. Yeah, I mean, learning Excel and stuff like that, even doing your budget or organizing your personal calendar or whatever you want to use it for, learning Excel is just a great thing to just pop on the resume and have it not be a lie. To actually know the program. These courses will increase your marketability, whether you're an employee, job seeker, consultant, or contractor. Register at mysoftwaretutor.com and use the promo code POD20 to save 20% off all registrations. Yeah, all right. Let's jump right back into the interview. What would you say to people about the death care industry or process? Is there a common question that you get or something that us on the other side don't know?
I've been getting a lot of questions recently, especially since COVID started, about people feeling drawn to get into death care, right? In
Mhm.
some way, whether to support others or work with the deceased. And I want people to know that being a funeral director and embalmer is not the only path in death care. There are countless paths, whether you're working with people when someone who has passed away to work through their grief, or you're sitting with families at the moment of death, or you're creating a product or a service that caters to those that are grieving. If you're feeling a call to support those who are experiencing loss because you yourself have experienced a loss, which a lot of us are because of COVID more so than ever, or you just feel compelled to get into this industry, don't limit your scope to just being a funeral director and embalmer, because it's not for everyone.
Mhm.
And I don't think people realize that funeral homes, and especially funerals, think about it, we're celebrating the life of an individual, right?
Mhm.
So everything that you've done from being born to dying, there are countless businesses and ideas and levels of support in between.
Mhm.
I worked with a client a couple months ago who has a coffee company, and she thought she needed to be a funeral director in order to incorporate her love for coffee into death care. And I'm like, why don't you just start a service where you offer coffee and sell it to funeral homes, or teas and sell it to funeral homes, and focus on the aromatherapy, or focus on special blends that are good for grief. And she's like, oh my God, I never thought of it. And I'm like, yeah, you don't have to go to mortuary school and become a funeral director because you're passionate about helping people that are grieving. You may not be cut out for this.
Yeah.
So, and don't feel
And
bad about that. It's not for everybody.
right. And even what you were describing with the community coming together, you could just be a good friend through your church or community or friends. Like
Right.
a person I interviewed, my friend Rajiv, has what he calls a dead dads club. And they put together these gift baskets for people who are going through the grief of their parent, right? He's a graphic designer, but does that on the side to help. Like there's multiple ways of helping. So I love
Right.
that encouragement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, even if you're an accountant and you want to give back to people that are grieving, offer to do deceased taxes.
Yeah.
Dead people still have to file taxes.
Right?
Whatever you do and whatever you're good at, it can be applied. So I think that's the number one thing right now.
Totally. You mentioned COVID. Has COVID hit your business hard? Has that created changes to how you usually go about caring to a body or wakes and or really the whole industry? I'm curious to hear how it's been different for you.
COVID has definitely hit the funeral industry because people are dying in numbers, that they don't die in every day.
Hmm.
As funeral directors and especially embalmers, we're trained to deal with things a lot worse than COVID. And with every deceased, we are taught to treat them with universal precautions, meaning we have the deceased here. We don't know what they died of. We're going to act like they have the bubonic plague,
Hmm.
typhoid fever, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, because we just don't know. So our first line of thought is protecting ourselves in every case. The thing about COVID is that it extends beyond the embalming room for us. Now, as funeral directors, we have to take precautions to protect those that are coming to celebrate the life of the deceased.
Hmm.
Either by state regulation in Georgia, at one point we were only allowed to have 10 people at a funeral. Then it was 20, then it was 30, then it was 50. Then it got lax, and now we're kind of going back down the number scale. We've had to become more creative in our industry. I've seen videos of the drive-through funerals, or drive memorials, or the drive-in memorial service where they actually have a screen and people park their cars. At our funeral home, we actually had individuals call in to the funeral home instead of coming by to express
Oh, nice.
condolences. And what we would do for any family was write, notes of condolences and tie them onto balloons to kind of weigh them down
Oh, that's
and put
wonderful.
them in the seat in the chapel. so that when the family comes in, even though there may not be a large number of people there, they see those balloons, and for each balloon, a condolence is expressed or
That's
an
a person.
individual.
Yeah. That's a person or a
Right. So,
family.
right. We've just had to become more creative. Personally, I feel as if the funeral industry up until COVID was about 10 to 15 years behind in using technological advancements and technology to our benefit. So I'm glad that we're now taking advantage of virtual consultations and arrangement conferences, because we should have been doing this years ago. It
Mhm.
would have been easier for families, it would have been less stressful for us. The
Yeah.
deceased may have not had to remain at the funeral home for as long, because we
Mhm.
would have been able to get paperwork done a lot faster. So that's another thing. There's a lot of funeral homes, we're still using paper everything. Due to COVID, we've had to lean more on electronic documentation.
Mhm.
A lot of states have been forced to look at their death certificate filing process. Here in Georgia, we have Gavers, but a lot of states were still doing paper death certificates, which is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
And because of
How easy that
COVID,
is to get lost, right? Like,
and it takes forever.
yeah.
It takes forever.
I feel like you give
Unnecessarily.
me like the insight, like we're just hanging out in the break room being like, can you believe how long this is taking?
It's just so refreshing to know now. Like, again, in Georgia that wasn't the problem, but I know people that were complaining in other states. I'm not going to call those states out, but I know they're so happy now because they've incorporated electronic death certificate systems. So
Yeah.
yeah. And you asked me what I want people to know about death care and COVID. I don't want everyone to assume that everyone that passes away during this time passes away of COVID. And I think that's a big misconception. And I don't know why people think that, but people still have other health issues. People still have things going on in their bodies, and they don't have COVID. So don't assume that everyone that passes away from COVID right now.
Right. We unfortunately, just because COVID got here doesn't mean we solved Alzheimer's and heart
Heart
attacks and
attack.
cancer and car
Right.
accidents. And yeah, of course, which is why it certainly gets scary when you hear about, hospital numbers increasing with COVID cases because they can't handle the normal routine amount of individuals that come to them.
Yeah.
Well, on the lighter side, you have a YouTube channel. I think you mentioned that you are transitioning more towards education. Was that like the first step in getting into education, or what made you want to create a YouTube presence?
Honestly, my YouTube channel was birthed from my blog,
Mm-hmm.
and it was for me just a way to express my thoughts and kind of deal with those emotions that I was feeling.
Yeah.
And then people started saying, hey, you should make a video about this. And I saw that Caitlin Doty had like this YouTube channel. I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool.
Mm-hmm.
I could do this. So I started making YouTube videos, and I did it for a long time before anybody even watched. But it just felt good to talk and get it out. And then people started asking questions. So I started making more videos. And I feel so bad now because I haven't posted a video in a few months because I've been so focused on my course development. But I'm excited to get back into a regular YouTube posting schedule.
Nice. That seems so rewarding to, especially find other people like yourself who are curious and may not have had the access that you had, right? With an uncle who was willing to answer
Right.
all your questions. So
Right.
that's great. I recommend that everyone check out your YouTube channel. It's The Grave Woman.
Thank you.
You know, I I don't even know how to start to ask this question, but I guess I'm just very curious about the process of caring for a body.
Okay.
I know that is very different from individual to individual, but maybe a starting place would be, what is embalming fluid doing?
Embalming fluid is a disinfectant and preservative.
Mm-hmm.
So the key ingredient in embalming fluid is formaldehyde. Basically, embalming fluid is replacing what would naturally be in your body, which would be blood,
Mm-hmm.
and it's disinfecting and preserving your remains.
How do you pump that through without a heart? Is there like a little?
The embalming machine has a setting on it that creates what would be considered an artificial heartbeat. So as the fluid is in the machine, it's being mixed, And then it's also, there's a rhythm that's basically pumping the fluid through your body. And you can actually hear the machine making that sound. It's like, yep.
Cool. And if you didn't do that, is that sort of just delaying the decay process so that there could be a showing, or that's done for all bodies?
Well, embalming is not required for all bodies. In most states, embalming is required if you are going to have a public viewing. And public means other than your family, like the person making the arrangements and maybe 2 or 3 other people. If you're going to have like a full-blown funeral, a lot of states require that you're embalmed. With COVID, but in Georgia, they've been embalming just about everybody at my funeral home. I'll speak for my funeral home, or direct cremation. We have not been showing deceased that have not been embalmed for the safety of the public, because we're still not sure whether COVID remains
right.
The body, point. On the casket, on of course the deceased isn't breathing, but the body is still releasing fluids and gas and I don't want to say air, but gas. If someone is not embalmed, embalming definitely retards the decomposition process. It does not stop the decomposition process. Depending on the strength of the fluid being used, you can have the bodies that are like at the bodies exhibit. That is some high level formaldehyde, like something that we would never use. I've always I need to do some research on that myself, because I watch a lot of forensic files and like true crime shows.
Yeah.
And when they do like disinterments and the individual is still kind of intact, I'm like, dang, that was some good embalming.
Yeah.
So I need
disrespecting the work of the yeah. I have one last question, and then I want to open the floor to anything else you think we should talk about. But my last question is, and if this is too personal, certainly push back. You work in death, you see it, you see what the process is like. How would you like to be prepared? Is cremation an option, or would you prefer to be buried?
Right now, I don't think I want to be embalmed. I would prefer to probably be cremated. And I want my family to go on a trip every year for my birthday and spread a little bit of me everywhere they go.
Oh, that's so wonderful.
Yeah.
I love the sound or the idea of that.
Make me a piece of jewelry, like make me into a piece of jewelry or something that they can wear wherever they go or something like that. I don't have anything against embalming. I just want something more natural, but I don't think I want like a green burial.
And a green burial is like where you're put in the ground in like a tree. I've seen like where the pods.
Well, I mean, you're put in the ground, or aquamation is considered green burial as well. That's where you're cremated with water instead of fire.
How does that happen?
That's a good question. I just know that it's water cremation.
Okay.
A good person to look to talk to about that would be Melissa Unford, the modern mortician.
Okay.
It would be a great
Sounds
resource.
Like another episode of Dead Space.
Because that's actually her specialty, that and green burial. But green burial, when I say green burial, I'm referring to being buried in a natural container, whether it be like a wicker casket or a shroud or something that's not metal, and placed in a cemetery that does not contain any of those materials, like a forest or just a natural burial site. I just don't think I want to be in the ground.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing everything. I just want to make sure, is there anything else that you would like to discuss? Anything you think I missed?
You did have a list in the question about why I transitioned to online.
Yeah.
And was it a good business move? It actually was kind of not even. There's a woman named Anita Polar Grant. She's known as the National Board Review Coach. And she contacted me for an interview just like this. But she said to me, each of your YouTube videos could be in a continuing education course. And you should really look into creating these courses, which was something I had no plan or thought of doing. And I did the first one, which was entitled Cultural Competency, Black Hair and Skincare for Non-Ethnic Death Care Professionals, where I basically teach non-Black or non-ethnic individuals how to care for Black hair, skin, and cosmetic needs at the time of death, because mortuary school is very whitewashed. We don't learn how to specifically deal with anyone's anything other than white people. That's just the truth. And so I've seen and heard horror stories of Black families going to non-Black funeral homes and the staff there not knowing what to do with the hair. I've seen working at in other funeral homes.
Oh no.
There was a lady who had braids similar to mine. This is not my hair, but had a style similar to mine. And I walked in and one of the funeral directors was cutting the braids from her scalp, which meant he was cutting all of her hair out.
Right.
And he didn't know. He just knew that the family wanted them out and wanted her natural hair out for the burial. But he had no idea how to properly remove her braids, which should have been very simple, you know.
Yeah.
But he didn't know. He wasn't doing it intentionally. But just little things like that can make family's memory picture. So once I put that course out, I thought of other things that needed to be taught from my perspective as a Black woman or a Black person. And then George Floyd was murdered. And the course from about racism was developed, which was extremely successful, where we talked about prejudice, bias, and racism in funeral service, which is very real.
Oh, I didn't see that on your channel yet. I'll check that out.
Yeah, I don't think it may be on the YouTube channel as an advertising, but it's on the website for sure.
Okay, good. Maybe we should do an episode on just that too.
Oh, for sure. I'm down. Just let me know.
I think that's something that I didn't even consider, but certainly important, especially with your describing educating people in the space itself, how to handle, non-white hair. I mean,
I have a whole course about it. So if your listeners are interested, check it out. But yeah, so it wasn't intentional at all. It ended up being a very good move. It has encouraged me to transition more of my time and energy in that direction. Well, that was great. The answer to that question.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful answer. I'm glad that you made sure that we discussed that, because I think that's all very important stuff. Well, I just want to thank you again. This has been such a delightful conversation, and it seems like if you're willing, we'll be talking again soon, because I think there's it's important to get that information out there.
For sure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
I hope I wasn't rambling once I start talking.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, there you have it. My conversation with Joèl Anthony, aka the Grave Woman. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. It kind of demystifies the process of preparing someone for a showing. Thank you so much for joining me for season 2, the start of season 2. Please be sure to check the show out on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at Death Space Filling the Void. Also, my personal is Patrick_E_Jones. If you're liking the show, please remember to rate and review it. That's super helpful. And since season 1 of my other podcast, That Gives Me Anxiety, is out there, feel free to check that out as well. All right. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. And I'll talk to you next week.